Hi, Gethin. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me. Really lovely to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it feels like we've got lots to talk about today, but probably not enough time to talk about it all. But yeah, looking forward to having a chat with you.
Thank you very much. Me too. So, as lots of people will know, we do Wellbeing Wednesdays for Be the Ripple, and that's the whole reason that I wanted to chat to you today, because I saw that you shared a tweet about an article that you wrote in HRZone, which was talking about the current pandemic and the impact that has on the well-being of people in customer-facing roles, and how that has an impact then on their mental health and generally on the way that they're feeling. So I thought that it would be really good for us, because it's Wellbeing Wednesday, to have a chat about it and to see some tips from you really as to what employers can do to look after their staff in these difficult times.
Yeah, so how this article came about is probably an insight into how I do my work, which might be quite interesting to people. But in a completely unrelated employer or HR magazine, I read a very small article that was like literally a paragraph or so talking about how I think her name is Jo Whitfield, the CEO of Co-op Food in the UK, who had started a petition to lobby government to make it a specific crime to direct abuse at people working in retail. So that a very specific crime in itself. And I thought that was interesting. So I read the proposal for the petition, and then I started looking into how much of an issue is this. And actually, I started to come across research that said in any one day, Co-op Food in the UK had experienced 150 instances or more of physical or verbal abuse directed at staff during the pandemic. And then I started to find that Waitrose saw the same, Superdrug saw the same. Superdrug launched a Be Kind campaign to actually encourage their customers to be kinder. And then I looked at the retail unions, the retail consortium, and then started to find all these figures about actually customer abuse has gone through the roof. And actually it kind of makes sense, right? We've locked people down. People are anxious, they're worried, they're scared. The uncertainty about the whole situation is fueling people to be probably a little bit more impatient than they would be in the environment. They are trying to keep their distance. We see all the videos, especially coming out of the US, about people, refusing to leave Walmart because they won't wear a mask and all this kind of stuff. And I really started to think about, what's the impact on the end employee here? And as I looked further, I found that the Financial Ombudsman Service has received a record number of complaints. Nationwide Building Society have got a record number of staff abuse and complaints. So this wasn't just retail and it wasn't just hospitality, because actually there's a whole big issue that's been caused by help out to eat out in this country, because actually you've started to have restaurants overwhelmed with all their tables covered, and that's caused stress and anxiety for employees. So right across the board, employees that are facing customers are not only dealing with worrying about themselves and worrying about money and worrying about their physical health, worrying about their family, worrying about the recession, everything that's going on in our lives at the moment. They're also dealing with this kind of echo pandemic, which is they're also dealing with everyone else's anxiousness and everyone else's anger and frustration. And so the research is showing us that on quite a large scale, employees are receiving record numbers of abuse and having arguments with customers. And when you look at the psychological impact of that, it's quite significant. It's the number one indicator of whether of turnover in the retail environment is not pay, is not managers looking after them, stuff like that. It's how they're dealing with customers and how customers are treating them. And I think even now, this article's been out for a week or so. I'm still alarmed that I can't find anyone else within the kind of employer and HR space talking about this stuff.
Uh-huh. And it is really interesting that it isn't being talked about more. When I read your piece this morning, I was just astounded by all of the figures, all of the statistics, and I had a little look around myself on the internet. And as I said to you before we started recording, I found something that they term retail rage, which is where they're talking about it happens so often that they've got this terminology around it now, and it's come to physical violence, and it's got a real big impact. So I think the question is really, well, two questions from me. Do you think that this kind of thing comes about from, historically it would have been the customer is always right kind of thing and you should be customer driven? Do you think that's got an impact?
Potentially, when I was doing my A-levels and through university, I worked in a stationery shop for 5 years or so. So I have a decent amount of experience in working in a customer-facing environment. And Yeah, I think so. I think so, and I think also, managers have never been very good, in my experience of retail, in sticking up for staff. You'd always get that really customer that was really annoyed. You'd explain the process to that customer and say, "Look, this is a policy. I can't change that." They would want to speak to your manager. You'd say, "Look, your manager is going to tell you the same thing I have." And then what would happen is that complaint would go to the manager, and the manager would make a different decision and make you feel like you were undermined. So maybe there is a little bit of that. Maybe there is a little bit of, in this world of transparency, we don't want customers to go online and give us bad reviews, and we don't want people to say our restaurant was terrible, because obviously they have the power of doing that, whether it was or not, whether the experience was fair or just. People can obviously still give a poor review. So I think that might be fueling some of it.
And do you think that, so people who are working from home, for example, and they're still customer facing in the respect that they're dealing with customers on the phone, do you think that there's the same kind of impact on those kinds of workers as well?
So I actually think it's worse. So there's a really big study. So Benefits Customer is BT, and there's a really big study BT did with Gallup, I believe, during the lockdown. Mm-hmm. And they were looking at the kind of mental health impact of call center workers who weren't actually face to face with each other. Because I've never been in a call center environment, but I have managed one in the past. And you will have a call with somebody, you'll take your headset off or put the phone down and kind of sit back in your chair and just take a breather and turn to a colleague and just kind of say, that was a really difficult call. And we used to have this really nice thing where a colleague would then come over and put a Mars bar on your desk and say, I heard that call and that was quite difficult. So just like take 5 minutes and we're all here for you. Yeah. And you can't do that at home because you're not sat amongst those people. You can't have that interaction. So we've been looking at, Benefits has got a recognition product, which we're using to help people at the moment with that kind of thing, is how do we build those connections? How do we build that support so that when you do have that difficult call, you've got somebody who's effectively virtually putting their arm around you and saying, I know that was difficult, take 5 minutes, switch off the focus on that. It means the next call is going to come through and take a breather. And I think that's far, far more difficult for people in those roles to do when they're at home. And especially as most contact center workers are of a certain age who are probably still living with their parents or living in shared homes. Mm-hmm. So, they sat at a little table or makeshift desk in their bedroom or at their kitchen table. So they don't even have the luxury of kind of space in many examples. So, I definitely think it's a big problem for people working in certain roles.
Okay. And that's what I would suspect it's like. And then it comes into your own home as well. So whether normally if you're based in a contact center, at least you've got somewhere you're going to, but it kind of comes into your own home. So there's not the divide between your safe space at home and the workplace then as well. So I suppose that's got an impact. So what advice would you give for retailers, for people who've got any staff who work in customer facing roles? What advice would you give them to ensure that there's kindness in looking after their well-being and taking care of those people?
So I think we run the risk at the moment of just accepting this situation as normal. It will recover. We will get a vaccine. That's kind of doesn't seem to be questioned. We will get a vaccine. It's just a case of when. And I think what people are kind of doing is not making long-term commitments to employees because we think the situation is going to change or it's going to get better. Whereas actually, what I'm telling our customers is you need to be building long-term strategies. Don't wait, don't let the vaccine be this pinpoint when everything's going to go back to normal, because it won't. Mm-hmm. And we will deal with the runoff of this stuff for a long time. So some shops might still keep restrictions whilst we're dishing out vaccines to people, which means for 12 months we could be having a traffic light system at a supermarket. We could be keeping our distance. Some products won't be available on shelves. And so employers need to make this long-term commitment, which is basically, we're all dealing with an awful lot. This is trauma. This is psychological trauma. What we're going through is psychological trauma. The research coming out from science journals like The Lancet, research that came out during the SARS and MERS epidemics in parts of Asia kind of 10, 20 years ago, all point to the fact that when we go through lockdown, we display symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So I cannot underestimate to any employer that people are going through an awful lot, probably the most stressed period in their lives. And so when we are doing performance management, when we are telling them off because they've made a mistake, we need to be different in how we're handling people. We need to give people a really wide berth, and we need to understand that we should focus in those examples. I think focusing on the underperformance as an issue rather than the underperforming as the person is what we should be focusing on. I think if we really want to be kind, we need to understand at the moment that people are dealing with a lot. They're probably dealing with stuff that we don't even know they're dealing with, because they might have a partner who's been furloughed or lost their job, and that's impacting their finances. So even though your relationship as an employer is with the employee and they might be fine, their family situation might not be fine. The people they spend time with might not be fine. And so I just feel like we really need to give people a bit of a break at the moment, and be prepared to give them a break for the next year or so, and start to just kind of, not necessarily take the pressure off, but make sure that we're letting people know that the power is in your hands to do whatever you need to do to be effective at work. And if that means I've just dealt with a really bad call and I need to take 10 minutes to walk around the block just to kind of decompress, we need to make sure that we're facilitating that with our employees.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And what do you think about from an employee perspective? So what can we as employees do to look after ourselves, to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves? So you've said about walking around the block if you need to, taking a little bit of a break. Is there anything else that we can do to make sure that we're looking after our well-being?
I mean, you could grow a moustache like I have, and
Well,
that's
I'm working
distracted
on
me
it.
for a while. Give myself something to trim and to comb every now and then is a bit of a grounding exercise, I think, which is kind of quite interesting. But I think it's important that people realize that our minds are always working. When you look at mindfulness, one of the things about mindfulness is, the brain isn't a muscle, but it kind of acts like a muscle. And so it never stops. It's like our heart. It's an organ that goes on and on. It's very difficult to give it a rest. But what we can do is, and you can't stop your brain, you can't stop your breathing. But what we can do is find grounding exercises that mean we focus on something pretty basic, without us focusing on everything else that's going on at the moment. So common grounding exercises might be gardening, baking, things like photography, just going for a walk. You're away from screen, you're not thinking about stuff. And I think when you focus on something that's a bit monotonous, your mind starts to sort stuff out in the background. So, and I think it's really important people realize that, because if we look at what makes people well, spending time in nature, spending time outdoors, sleeping well, healthy diet, all this exercise, all this stuff we know is the best way for us to have good mental health. But we find it so difficult to do that. And with the restrictions some people are under, that can be even more difficult. So I think trying to think about what you can control. And, I know over the last week or so, I've really benefited from just laying on the bed in the evenings, just listening to music, literally staring at the ceiling, not doing anything. And it feels like I'm going to bed so much calmer, because whilst I'm just staring at the ceiling or not really thinking about anything, my mind is sorting through the day's events and is kind of giving me that time to break. And I think from an employer point of view, that kind of stuff happens quite a lot in a normal working day. You're stood at a coffee machine waiting for your coffee to come out. You literally just stood in a canteen or kitchen.
Yeah.
You walk to the sandwich shop on your own. You're stood at the printer, or you're stood at the photocopier, just like dazing out the window while you're getting your work done for a few minutes. Those little casual kind of moments and pauses in our day naturally are not occurring when we're at home. We're kind of on, and the research is saying that, people have taken commutes out of their days, but actually what they're doing is working instead. So there's this new trend of creating a faux commute. So actually creating a structure to your day where you're giving yourself 20 minutes before you start work to read a book, to go for a walk. And so I think making those pauses is really important for the employer as well, because that's when we innovate. That daydreaming is a really important psychological function. It's where we come up with ideas and we solve problems. So I think, we just need to give everyone a bit more space, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see your point there with regard to the taking space and the pauses, because I think that that's the time that you can process anything that's happening. And particularly when we're talking about difficult conversations with customers, potentially, that's the time that we can decompress and deal with that and be back on form again for the next customer that we speak to.
Exactly that, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way that you said about controlling as well, because that's my husband's favorite advice ever, is control the controllables. And I kind of try to live by it now. So fabulous. So I think it would be interesting, really, if we put a shout out to find out as well, what are people doing? What are employers doing? What are individuals doing to look after the well-being, specifically, I suppose, for the people in customer-facing roles. It would be interesting for us to find out what people are doing, and perhaps we can have a conversation again at some point.
Yeah, I would love for people who run contact centers in particular, because I think that's a kind of high pressure environment with lots of young people working in it. I would love to find out kind of how are you maintaining that connection, because people in their 20s, a lot of their friends exist at work, and I think we forget that, and so we've taken them away from their friends during this whole environment. So how are you building that community? How are you keeping that community well-being high and positive? I'd love to hear more about that.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, thank you very much for having this chat with me today. As I said, I saw your tweet this morning and I thought it's really strange that people aren't talking about this more. So let's have a chat. So thanks very much. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll get lots of stories from people about what is happening at the moment.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gethin.